Good evening and welcome to Mysteries of the Liturgies. I am Father David Michaud, and I am glad to be with you. We are trying this on the live stream, and I had a few things, but I think we're good to go. I hope we are. I want to share with you the second lesson in the Mysteries of the Liturgies, which is a bit of a history. So that you can find the outline for tonight's class on the website under our Learn page, www.stpeterschurch.net. Go to the Learn page, and under Mysteries of the Liturgies, there is a outline for Lesson 2. So it's great to have you with us this evening. Let me begin with the prayer. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come and learn about some of your mysteries. Enlighten us, dear Lord. Help us to gain some knowledge and insight in how we worship, why we worship, and how we have worshiped through the ages. All this we ask in your name. Amen. So let me talk first about early Christian worship, because how we worshiped back then is different, but yet in some ways similar to what we are doing now in worship. Most of early Christian worship that we know about was done in the home church. We didn't have a lot of assembly buildings to go to. Mostly the church gathered in somebody's home, often a room set aside for worship. The church in the first couple of centuries was a bit more disorganized, more regional, overseen by a bishop with some deacons, and to help in serving the congregation. The earliest liturgies that we see come from some different sources. So there would be, as part of a weekly gathering, they would gather on a Sunday, the day of our Lord's resurrection, and they would have some scriptures, and there would be some study and some teaching. And that kind of went back to the synagogue of people coming together to study scriptures. So there would be that kind of activity. There would also be some of the earliest liturgies we have, the recitation of psalms and the singing of hymns, and that harkens a lot back to the temple culture, Jewish temple culture too. But then there would be a sacramental meal, a Eucharist, and that would be a more unique thing for Christians. Basically, remembering the Last Supper, remembering our Lord, and having the bishop presiding over a Eucharistic meal that would then be shared with a bread and wine that would be shared with the congregation. The Eucharist itself was restricted to only the baptized. So if you weren't baptized, when it came to the meal portion, you were excused. You were certainly welcome to be a part of the study of scriptures and all of that. But it was only when you were baptized, as you were fully a member of the church, that you were able to partake of the Eucharistic meal. We noticed that, again, we would see in the early church more of the orders of bishop presiding and deacons who were supporting the bishop. Prayers were done in plural, so it wasn't an I, it was a we kind of thing. It was a corporate praying. And also, in the earliest centuries, we would have people praying in what we call the orans position. People wouldn't pray like that on their knees. They would be standing up, and they'd be offering their hands up like that. And you can see that in some early Christian frescoes and such, that this is how people would pray. Where do we see that now? Pretty much when the priest prays in the Eucharistic prayer, prays in the orans position, hearkening back to the early centuries of prayer that people undertook in the early churches. So that tended to be the way we were seeing liturgy performed until we got to Christianity being the state religion of the Roman Empire. That happened in the early 4th century. 312 AD, Constantine declares that the Roman Empire is a Christian nation. And so what was happening is everybody then was to convert from the pagan religion of worshiping the emperor to one of Christianity, of worshiping our Lord Jesus Christ. And so it came from some smaller churches and groups around to everybody in the empire was then to be converted to Christianity. So what they ended up doing is you couldn't fit all these folks into to a home or different house churches, so they repurposed some government buildings, some basilicas, which were large government buildings, to be churches or places where people would gather. And you would see that oftentimes a basilica, which would be kind of like what was happening is because there were so many more people that were part of this of the church, the bishop needed help. So we were then seeing for the first time more presbyters, or as we know, it comes down to us as priests, and they would be sitting over here. Then we'd have deacons over here as well. One of the other things that we saw happen in Christianity at that time was we started having processions, and in a procession where you have like a governor or even the emperor presiding, the emperor would always go first. So the most important people would be first, and then the least important people would follow up at the end. But when they did a procession in the church, we had the opposite. Because remember, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. So the bishop then would be in the most humblest position of last, and we would have people in descending order all the way to the front. So lay people, and then we'd have clerics, and then the bishop at the end, which kind of turned around that understanding of pageantry that in the Roman Empire. One of the other things that we saw was a lot more furniture of the tables and other adornments that we were seeing, because it often took on the pageantry of the state religion, and so you're seeing a lot more attention paid to that and a lot more money that can go for that as well. We saw also the codification of practices. One thing the Romans liked is they liked everything to be done by the book in just such way, very ordered. And remember when we had different bishops with different groups, there was an overall general understanding of belief, but there were some deviations and all. And so the bishop then asked that, it was the emperor. Excuse me a moment. I need to attend to something right here. Sorry about that. So where was I? So we then had the Council of Nicaea, where all of the bishops in the Roman Empire came to the town of Nicaea, and the emperor was there too, Emperor Constantine, and he actually ran that meeting, and he said, "All right, this is what we're going to believe." And so they hammered out what we now know as the Nicene Creed. Hello, Mary, come on in. I am. I'm doing a live stream for folks, but you please have a seat, and we can. I've got a outline for you right over here, and we're talking about history of liturgy, talking about the Roman Empire and all of that. Okay, So feel free to ask any questions and all as we go along. Welcome. So what ended up happening is that they passed the Nicene Creed, which we heard, and that is that became the basis for belief in this growing church. One of the other things we saw when the Christianity became the state religion was that, and everybody had to convert, or was supposed to convert to Christianity. They were saying, well, what about families? Before, the Christianity used to be more of an adult kind of a religion, but they said, well, we need to also include families, and so then for the first time we're seeing a lot more infant baptisms, people being baptized so that they can all, the families and all, can be part of the new state religion. So that started to make an appearance as well. Now, also, there was the Delineation of Diocese, which were different geographical areas that a bishop had control or was responsible for. So that started happening in the Roman Empire. Again, the Romans wanted to make things kind of much more ordered and all, too. And then there was also the development of particular sees where you have bishops that were overseeing larger geographical areas, and that all happened as Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. One thing that stopped, though, when Christianity became the state religion was martyrdom, was the killing of Christians, because, of course, now it's the state religion. So what is one to do if one wants to be a martyr for the church? Well, what replaced that was the ascetical movement of monasteries, of monks, of hermits, and all that would just go out into the wilderness themselves and live a ascetic lifestyle. So we saw the rise of a lot of monastic orders as a result of the fact that was how people were playing out their martyrdom or their witness to Christ once there was no persecution of Christians. Of course, if you did not follow what the Roman beliefs in the church, then you were, of course, a heretic, and so they certainly were trying to stomp out heresies as well as that time. So you see a lot more of that. What is orthodox? What is heresy at that time? Yes. Uh-huh. All right. Oh yeah. Well, Emperor Constantine at the Battle of Milvian Bridge was trying to take over and it became Constantinople and be reigning emperor. And so he had this battle, which was and he put the Cairo, which is the symbol of Christ, on all of his banners and all of his shields. And with that, he went into battle and won. And he credits his ascendancy to Jesus Christ. And so he's then believing that he needs to then have the empire. If he becomes the emperor, he is going to have help Christianity to become the state religion. So it went into that. So now we have an established religion where it was, as I was saying, it's a small group of people that were faithful in the first couple of centuries. Now you've got millions of people in the Roman Empire. They're doing that. So what ended up happening was you had also in the Roman Empire, you ended up having 4 different centers of liturgy that all had kind of slightly different ways that they would undertake and do the liturgy. So you had the East Syrian, headquartered in Edessa, which was in eastern Syria, and that really influenced the liturgical patterns and practices of Christians in Persia and India and Asia. Then you had the West Syrian center of liturgy both in Antioch and Constantinople, now in present-day Turkey, that ended up being what we now know as the practices more of the Eastern Orthodox. A third center of Christianity and of liturgy in the Roman Empire was Alexandria in Egypt, and from there came the Coptic religion and also some Eastern Orthodox religion. And then we had the fourth center, which was Rome, and from there we get Roman Catholicism. So that's center. Now, all four of those centers were led by a bishop called a pope. So you had the Pope of Edessa, the Pope of Antioch, the Pope of Alexandria, and the Pope of Rome. They were all equal in all. Now, as the empire started splitting up and all, then you had a Western and an Eastern, and the Western kind of went up into Europe and all. The Eastern was staying in the eastern side. So you only had one center in the west of liturgy. And what was that? It was Rome. So Rome then became more and more the dominant authority, and so the Roman rite of doing things centered in Rome then became one that was transported into different parts of Europe. But while we had that, so for instance, in England, because we're coming from the Church of England, we had certainly Christianity was there in Roman times, because Rome, of course, became a Christian nation. But then when you had the invasions of the Anglo-Saxons and such, that was driving out any Christians that were there, any Roman Christians. And it was then reintroduced. Christianity was reintroduced, one by St. Augustine, St. Augustine, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, who came from the Pope from Rome, sent him to re-establish Christianity according to the Roman way, while also from Ireland we had, traveling to Iona, the Celtic Christians, who had a different take on some of the liturgy and Christianity, and they then came to Iona in Scotland and then into England. So you had in England different styles of worship, both the Roman way and the Celtic way. And it was at the Synod of Whitby where it was decided that in England we would go more with the Roman Rite, although there still is certainly much Celtic influence over our church. Couple of things in the medieval church, we saw a lot of some additional changes for like in the role of clergy and laity. There became different orders of clergy, and were different steps and all of them. You had a subdeacon and a deacon. You had different orders of priests and all of that. There became to be restrictions on the laity receiving communion. And in fact, most of the time what happened was that the priest would say a mass and would hold up the bread and the wine, and people would gaze at it. But that would be it. There would be no then consumption. Then it got to the point where they could receive bread at some point, but not the wine. And so it's very interesting if you look at some of the artifacts from early Christianity in the first few centuries. The chalice tends to be pretty wide. By the time we get to medieval times, it's very narrow because only the priest was drinking the wine. So it was very interesting how those artifacts kind of told the tale of how things were getting to be in those times. Yes. So in 730 there was a decree from Leo III, the Pope, saying because there was a concern about having different idols or different depictions in art of God and of saints and all of that, and we can't be having saints statues because we can't be worshiping. And he pointed out that only God can have adoration, but saints can be venerated. It's not the same as adoring them or worshiping them, but there is that veneration. And so it was determined that, and in part with the Nicaea II conference in 787, that there was a distinction made between representations of God and of saints, and that you can have that it's not a forbidden practice. So there was a real controversy. Can you? And then from there, we see a lot of art that is just blossoming as a result in the Middle Ages, and of course into the Renaissance and all too. So then, but one of the other things that happened in the medieval church was the real form of the spread of monastic orders, of monasteries throughout Europe and in England and all, and the development of monastic prayers. So there would be a real emphasis on reciting the entire Psalter, the 150 Psalms from the Old Testament, and do that within like a week's time. So a lot of psalm recitation. There was also a lot of reading of scriptures and prayers, and they prayed every 3 hours. They had particular prayers. So you'd have the nocturnes, the lauds, the terce, the sex, the none, the vespers, and the compline. So a lot of formalizing and formalizing of monastic prayers in the medieval period. So we look at the liturgy of the Eucharist in medieval times. We see that a lot of it was framed by the architecture of the medieval cathedral and the church. Cathedrals began being built in the Middle Ages. The advances in technology made it possible to have buildings that soared up to heaven. And the idea was when you went in a cathedral, it was like you were in heaven itself. And if you've ever been to these cathedrals in England or in Europe, you can see that's certainly on display. So that became a big, and just the separation between the people in the nave and then the choir in the chancel, and then the sanctuary, which was all only clergy could come into, where Eucharist was celebrated. So all of that kind of took more shape like that in the Middle Ages. So also by then we had a real liturgical shape of what you would come to expect for a Eucharist when you came into the church, and it was the Roman Rite. So the Roman Rite would have a collect to start, an epistle, a blessing before the gospel. They'd have a gospel, and then an offertory prayer, a preface, and then a canon, which was the Eucharistic prayer, the Lord's Prayer, a Pax Domini, or passing of the peace, and then a post-communion collect and a dismissal by the celebrant or the deacon. So that was and it sounds kind of familiar because a lot of that is the way we do our Eucharist now. But that all came very formulated by the Middle Ages. Now, the Roman Rite also, though, borrowed and added a few things in the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, we started seeing asperses and psalm verses and prayers said by the priest when he ascends up to the altar. So there's a lot more complicated prayers that are said as he went to the altar. And then they also put in the Kyrie eleison, which is the Lord have mercy, and that comes from the Eastern Orthodox, and that had, which we had seen that since the early 5th century, but that then becomes incorporated into the liturgy in the West in the Middle Ages. The Gloria in Excelsis was also put in the Middle Ages into the Roman Rite, and that comes from the East, and that because that was being said in the East, in the Syria, Eastern Syria, Western Syria, Rite since the 6th century. A credo was added, so like the Nicene Creed and Apostles' Creed, they were added in the 11th century. And then we also had prayers accompanying the offertory actions, the psalm at the lavabo. All of these different things were added in the Middle Ages. And then we had the Agnus Dei was added, prayers accompanying communion. And then we also saw, for the first time in the Middle Ages, different items of chant, an introit, a gradual, offertory, and communion. So as soon as these kind of things appeared elsewhere, Rome adopted them as part of its rite. So what we see is we see the basic Roman Rite that's kind of really added to a lot more prayers, a lot more singing and all that happens as we go into the Middle Ages. We also see some other customs coming in the Middle Ages. Kneeling and genuflecting. Those are things that started out at that time. Prior to that, it was either you were either standing or you were sitting to receive teachings and all too. But there was the kneeling and the genuflecting come about as a result of, that's what you would do when you were in front of your Lord. It was part of the process of being obedient, serfs to lords and all of that, and so they adopted that same kind of humility for Christ in the church. So also things like the sign of the cross, started making the sign of the cross more generally during the Middle Ages. The ringing of Sanctus bells, and transubstantiation, the idea or the understanding that the bread and wine is transformed into the actual flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. That teaching really it was around, but I guess it was kind of firmly established as the teaching, what you're to believe in the Middle Ages. So all this to say is we're getting a lot more things as moving parts as part of the liturgy when we get to the Middle Ages. Questions?
Well, how did the people take it, the brethren? Were they some that they had to be very adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
This is all coming on. Are they changing?
Well, the laity didn't have much to say about what was going on. I mean, it was the clergy that were adding to the different. But I think that there also was an understanding of what each role was, and for the laity, it was just watch, observe, say a few responses, but it was in Latin too. So it was very, what exactly was going on. That's why they had the Sanctus bells that would ring when the priest would elevate the host and the bread, the chalice, because it would be a signal to the laity that something's going on, because they didn't understand, because it was Latin. So when you ring a bell, and oftentimes what would happen is they would be kind of gathered, they would be in the nave and be standing and maybe even chatting a bit too. And then when the priest says in Latin the words of institution and the bell is rung, then they all gaze at the host and at the chalice. But again, there's the priest is the one that would generally be receiving communion. The laity would just be pleased to just be in the presence of God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now we get to kind of Reformation, and we get to how liturgy changed when the Church of England became its own church, with Henry VIII and the Parliament dissolving the relationship between the Pope and the English Church. And the English Church was still part of that medieval church. I mean, it's not like it stopped doing everything. It was still doing all of these things. Still, the Sarum Rite, which is the rite, liturgical rite that was being practiced in Salisbury Cathedral, for instance, was very close to follow the Roman Rite and all too. So the English Church was very medieval, and it came into so. But one of the things that kind of brought it some reform was the original prayer book, the prayer book of 1549. Here are some things that kind of challenged the way liturgy had been done in the medieval times. One, liturgy was in English. So the prayer book of 1549 put all of the liturgies not in Latin, but in English, so everybody could understand. Then what Archbishop Cranmer, who wrote the prayer book of 1549, did was he took some of the monastic prayers and all those psalms and prayers, and he from there he put together what we call the daily office. So he took a couple of those different 3 hours, their intervals of prayer, and combined them for morning prayer in the morning, and couple of prayers in the evening for evening prayer in the evening. So he takes that. He takes certainly a lot of the elements of the Sarum Rite from the Salisbury Cathedral. And then he also, in the prayer book, refers to Eucharist, the bread and wine that had been blessed as Holy Eucharist, not as an act of transubstantiation, but of real presence. That through the Eucharistic prayer, the bread and wine are changed into the real presence of Christ. And that could mean a number of different things. So very, very English church. Also something the English church did through the prayer book of 1549 was allowing the laity to drink from the cup. So it was a very big thing that no longer would the priests forbid the laity drinking the chalice. So that then became a big, which is why I think when we have our pandemic and we weren't allowed to drink from the chalice, for a number of people who are Anglican, it's kind of like, well, that's kind of how we defined ourselves a bit too. So the other thing that the English church stopped doing was private masses. Private masses were a very big part of the medieval church. So that would mean that one priest could just be in a chapel and say a mass by himself, for somebody else for an intention. There were some people who paid a priest to say a mass for them every day, or also endowed a little chapel within the church, so that even when they died, the priest would be praying for them in purgatory every day. Those kind of private masses were then taken down by the English church. The understanding then was that the priest himself does not consecrate the elements, but it is the church together, led by the priest, that consecrates the elements. So that means even today, that in order for me to lead a service of Holy Eucharist, I have to have at least one other person with me. I can't just do that by myself. And that was one of the I guess reforms or so from the liturgical practices that the English Church did. Yeah.
When all of this was going on in England,
Mm-hmm.
and they were changing what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
all of these other groups, the Syrian, West Syrian, how were they responding to that? Were they?
Well, a lot of them hadn't gotten medieval. The Roman Rite got a lot of trappings on it in medieval times in the West. We didn't see that. Some of the rites in the Eastern churches were already had a lot of trappings on them, so they followed a different course than happened in the West. Although some similarities too, but I think it was really shown in, because again the Reformation was about a lot of excesses in the church, including liturgical practices. That Luther and Calvin and other reformers, and what they did even is they said, let's throw it all out, or throw all this stuff out. We will, we're going to be a much more stark liturgy. Maybe no, we don't need to have the bread and wine, and so a number of churches decided that we're going to be more the liturgy of the word than we are the liturgy of the table. So a lot of different. The English church probably less radical in its Reformation than some other churches too. Some of the other things that we had is there was a lot of the traditional vestments, especially in the Reformation. We saw more plain vestments and all of that. So this all carried over to the American Prayer Book of 1789, because when America got its independence, it could no longer pledge its support to the king or pray for the king. And so we saw an American prayer book that prayed for the president, and also made some changes in their prayer book from the English, had some Scottish influence over the Eucharistic prayer, which incorporated some of the Eastern church's elements as well. So the American Prayer Book had as part of it the 1764 Scottish Rite, which was much more West Syrian in structure, and it also had components in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer from England, which had more of a Roman structure to it too. Also called for much more austere ornamentation investments. So we see that in the early part of the Episcopal Church in the late 18th and early 19th century. And then we had, in the 1830s, we had it was called the Oxford Movement, or an Anglo-Catholic movement. It was an attempt to bring back some ceremonial adornments and encouraging communion, because a lot of services were now going without communion every Sunday, and there was also an encouragement to have a more of a solemn high mass, saying that not all the stuff that we gave up in the Middle Ages was bad. Some of the things, some of the adornment, some of the beauty should come back into the church. And there was it kind of let's see. It did, however, the Oxford movement said that the Eucharist is not the monopoly of the priest, and that it should be given more to the people, not just, and that even communion should happen one day a week, and that there should be hymns and service music and all of these things. So that really brought back a lot of questions about what should we be doing in liturgy. And a number of things started happening in the early 19th century with the liturgical movement. Books like Shape of the Liturgy by Gregory Dix in 1945 had an enormous influence over Episcopal, Roman, and other denominations, because he went back and looked at what is the basic shape of the liturgy. And he said there are four basic parts of it. It's a taking the bread and wine. It's a blessing the bread and wine, breaking the bread, and then sharing. Taking, blessing, breaking, and sharing. And that was an essential part of Eucharistic. So it says that Eucharist is fundamentally an action done in community, not a rite said by a priest while people listened and watched. And so they had a number of conversations about how we might celebrate together. And so one of the things they looked at, well, what were they doing back in the early church? And what were some of the other ancient prayers that we could kind of recover? And so things started happening, like in 1952, the church canons were amended to permit a licensed lay reader to read the epistle at Holy Communion. And then we had in 1969, women allowed to participate as lay readers, the same as men. In the 1960s, we had a lot of other things like that happened, and a lot of it was they look back to the early church. Let me get back to that, and they looked at the role of the presider, and the bishop was like presiding in community. It wasn't by himself, but rather with everything. Looked at what the church architecture was in early times, standing and participating, and so there was a real move for freestanding altars. I mean, St. Peter's, of course, is one of the only churches that its main altar is not freestanding, but we do have a freestanding altar in the chapel right next to it. But there was an attempt to move that so that that would be people would be around the table rather than just kind of away from it. And then there was an incorporation, not only the Roman Eucharistic prayer, but also elements of the West Syrian and Alexandrian Eucharistic prayers from the ancient times, and those we kind of see in Rite 2, in our Eucharistic prayers of B, C, and D. But there was a great involvement of the laity. That laity need to have a role in the and also a lot more back and forth speaking roles. So the prayer book of 1979 took a lot of that interest in revising the liturgy and put it into that form. So we have a lot more contemporary language. Recall that the prayer book of 1549 used Elizabethan language because it was written in Elizabethan times. That's the way they talked. So it was very, that was kind of the new, that was the contemporary language of the time. And so the reformers in the 20th century said we need to have more contemporary language to get back to that original idea in the first prayer book. They had things like trying to make things as gender neutral as possible. There were some kind of anti-Semitic prayers that they got rid of as well. And then there was also a desire that we have the same, are reading the same readings in church as other denominations are too. And so there was this effort to do a common lectionary. And so we're very similar now in our readings every week to the Roman Catholics, to the Lutherans, to the Methodists, in an attempt to try to bring people together in commonality. One of the things that was very interesting in the 1979 prayer book was a new understanding of baptism. The baptism wasn't just a way that a newborn enters into the world, a rite of passage to say, but rather is the way that someone enters into the church community. And baptism used to be more of a kind of a event, of a family event, and the 1979 prayer book brought that back into the main celebration of worship. Because if you're welcoming somebody into your church, then the whole congregation should be there when that person is baptized and welcomed by the whole congregation. So that was a change in norms from what it had been in the early prayer books and early understanding. And it comes back to the early understanding of baptism when people would when they weren't baptized, they had to leave before Eucharist, and they studied and studied, and then it was when they were baptized and then brought before the bishop on Easter morning that they then were able to celebrate Eucharist and all fully as a member. So there's the same kind of effort to do that. And some of the most ancient rituals or liturgies that we find on Holy Week were brought into this prayer book of 1979. So the Maundy Thursday service with the washing of feet and the stripping of the altar, the Good Friday service with many ancient, the solemn collects were formed many centuries ago and brought back into there, for instance, and the veneration of the cross, and then the Easter Vigil, in which we have where the baptism is just before Easter, like it was in the early church, the reading of the prophecies, the studying, and then the first Eucharist of Easter with bells ringing and things of that sort. Those were things that came back from our past and are now being celebrated in our church today. Where we are now is kind of taking some of what we had lost before and bringing that into our celebration. There's a variety. We have taken some of the things, the busyness of medieval times, and kind of stripped ourselves of that. We have also had the opportunity to reclaim some of our the beauty of our churches, our adornments, our vestments and all, but also look at what is the simplicity of worship too, to not do things just because they feel good, but that they're pointing to something, pointing to God.
It sounds like a very organic process.
Mm-hmm.
And what I hear you saying is that it's constantly evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in kind of another state? Will we go to another state?
Yeah, it's constantly evolving. I don't know if you heard that or not, folks, but it's every 2 or 3 generations we do a new prayer book in the church. based on kind of where we are headed, what are we finding, what do we know that we didn't before, and so we had a prayer book, and our first American prayer book is the prayer book of 1789. We then had a prayer book in 1892. We had another one in 1928, and now one in 1979. So some are saying, we've had some additional liturgical materials, enriching our worship, number of different things that have been authorized by General Convention that we are using too. But there are people, and in fact the church is now looking at what will the next prayer book be? What will the next Book of Common Prayer be? What will be retained? What will we be adding? And some say, well, maybe we won't have a prayer book at all. Maybe the important thing to remember in the Book of Common Prayer is common prayer, because what the Book of Common Prayer does is allow us to all pray the same or pray in similar ways. So where will we as a church, as we go into the 21st century, be praying together? Will we be praying together?
What do you think?
I think we'll continue to do that. I think there's enough. The liturgy is strong and deep, and it survives centuries, and I think we'll continue to help people to encounter the divine in rich ways. But there may be ways we want to do things that we hadn't thought about before. But it needs to be relevant, and I think for future generations, we know our liturgy and how we're worshiping to be relevant. So I think, and as long as people are very conscious and passionate about liturgy, I think we'll do well. I think when people don't care, but that's not what I know about Episcopalians. I really care about doing good liturgy and good worship. Yeah. No, you're fine.
When you say conquer the divide, can you explain that? Divide of what?
Divide.
Conquer the divide in the book, in the common. They had different purposes: inclusion of people, praying in a common sense, and you said conquer the divide.
I think I meant encountering the divine. Yes, encountering the divine. Yes. So I mean, it's how we can use liturgy as a way to provide the structure for us to enter into a deeper relationship with our Lord, and to be able to kind of go on the edge and all too. Yeah, I mean I think we talked a bit about that at our last class, that liturgy allows you to go kind of maybe to be safe while also being able to go out and explore and go kind of to the edge of being comfortable, knowing that God is with you. And liturgy is also something we do corporately. So we're doing this all together. It's not like you're on your own, and you're doing it with God. And I like the liturgy also invites and makes you a participant, as opposed to just being spoken to. We are going back and forth. We are call and response kind of thing. We are reacting to God in our lives, and a liturgy will help bring you to a different place. With liturgy, you do not exit a church the way you enter in. Yeah.
So whatever you're saying is that each person individually can move through their own personal experimentation with the liturgy as the access, as a transportation, and then but within the larger confines of the group. So they have a support both ways.
I mean, you think of like some of the most beautiful liturgical moments in the year. I think are on the Easter Vigil, in which we, as the sun sets, we light the new fire of Easter, and we take from that the light on the Paschal candle, and and we light that outside in the courtyard. And that's dark outside. The deacon first enters with the light of Christ into the dark church, and we all get our candles lit from that. And so it is almost like we are entering into a tomb with life, with light. And then, of course, through that liturgy, the light overcomes the darkness, and we experience the resurrected Christ. I mean, that whole liturgy is moving us towards, exploring tomb-like encounters, but in a way we are together, and we know that Christ is with us. So there's a lot of symbolism that helps bring you into that.
Would you say it's more, liturgy is more emotional?
I think it's both, and it's also very sensual, because you use your senses, and in fact, a lot of what you do in liturgy is moving your body, which your body does. It's not just the words; it's what you are doing with your body and how you are incorporating the senses. What are you seeing? Music you're hearing, the incense you're smelling, the communion you're tasting, the feel of somebody shaking your hand at the sign of peace, shaking your hand as you're coming in and out. All of these are different elements of liturgy, as we talked about last week. And I'm sorry we weren't able to broadcast it either. We've now hopefully fixed those problems. But there's some good handout. In fact, I can give you one after the class too. All right. Well, that's just hopefully giving you a little bit of a flavor of some of the history of liturgy throughout Christianity, and kind of the fact that what we have now is not just something we've thought up out of whole cloth, but our liturgy is based on a 2,000-year history of liturgical practice. And so some of the things you wonder, why we do this, why we do that, it's part of our history. Now, next week we will be looking at the liturgy of Holy Eucharist. So we're going to kind of break it down and see what is going on here and there, and and certainly happy to answer questions about anything that you've been wondering about with that. But we'll start out with Holy Eucharist, and then the next class we'll do baptism, the liturgy of baptism, and we'll look at some of the early rites of baptism, and then how we do baptism now, and then we'll end on the last class by looking at the liturgies of Holy Week, because they're different from the ones we usually experience on Sunday. So I want to kind of go over them, and I hope people will take the opportunity to go to these liturgies, or at least watch them on the live stream. And hopefully, if after we've talked about them, you may gain some new insights onto them as well. So that's the rest of the class. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you next week. Let me turn off my microphone.